The day my grandmother died, I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye. I was wrong. The hardest part came 3 hours after her funeral, when my older brother stood in the doorway of the house where I had spent most of my childhood and told me to leave. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply folded his arms, looked at me and said, "You've had enough time." I stared at him. Enough time for what? He glanced toward my grandmother's living room. "For pretending this house is yours." Those words hit harder than I expected. Because for 27 years, that house had been the closest thing I had to home. My grandmother, Evelyn Parker, had raised me for several years after my parents divorced. She taught me how to cook, how to save money, how to recognize when someone was lying, and most importantly, how to stand on my own feet. She used to tell me, "People reveal themselves when money enters the room." I never understood how true that sentence would become. My brother Daniel had always been different. He was the successful one. At least that was what everyone said. He had a good job, expensive clothes, a large house, and a talent for making people believe he had everything under control. I was the opposite. I worked ordinary jobs. I lived simply. And because I didn't make much money, my family treated me like I had failed at life. Daniel especially loved reminding me of that. At family dinners he would laugh and say, "Maybe one day you'll finally figure things out." I usually ignored him. My grandmother never did. Whenever Daniel made a comment like that, she would look at him and say, "Never confuse money with character." That usually ended the conversation. After she died, however, there was no one left to stop him. The morning after the funeral, I returned to the house to collect a few personal belongings. Daniel was already there. So was my mother. They were sitting at the dining table surrounded by folders. I immediately knew something was wrong. My mother looked at me and said, "We need to talk." I put my bag down. "About Grandma?" Daniel shook his head. "About the house." I looked around the room. "What about it?" Daniel pushed a folder across the table. "Our lawyer confirmed that the property is being transferred." "To whom?" He smiled. "To the family." I frowned. "That doesn't answer my question." Daniel leaned back. "The house isn't yours." I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom," she finally said, "your grandmother changed some things before she died." I felt my stomach tighten. "What things?" Daniel opened the folder. "According to the documents we have, the house will remain under family ownership." I reached for the papers. Daniel pulled them back. "You don't need to worry about the details." I stared at him. "Why are you hiding them from me?" He laughed. "We aren't hiding anything." "Then show me." Silence. That was when I knew. Something was very wrong. I stood up. "I want to see the original will." Daniel's expression changed. "There is no reason for you to get involved. She was my grandmother. And she was our grandmother too." Then he said the sentence I will never forget. "You should be grateful we're even letting you stay here this long." I looked at my mother. She finally whispered, "Maybe you should go." I couldn't believe it. I had just buried the woman who had raised me. And now my own family was throwing me out of her house. I packed my things. Before leaving, I walked upstairs to my grandmother's bedroom. The room smelled exactly like her. Lavender. Old books. Wood polish. I stood beside her dresser and tried not to cry. Then I noticed something strange. Her jewelry box was open. Inside was a small handwritten note. It had my name on it. I opened it. There were only 6 words. "Do not trust Daniel with anything." My hands started shaking. I read it again. Then again. Why would Grandma write that? And when? I slipped the note into my pocket. I walked downstairs. Daniel was waiting. He held the front door open. "You should leave now." I looked at him. "Enjoy the house." He smiled. "I intend to." I walked outside. But I wasn't thinking about losing the house anymore. I was thinking about my grandmother's note. And one question kept repeating in my head. What exactly had she known about my brother? For the next 5 days I stayed in a small apartment across town. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes I saw my grandmother's face. I kept thinking about that note. Then I remembered something else. 2 weeks before her death, Grandma had called me. She sounded tired, but strangely calm. She asked me one question. "Do you still have the little brass key I gave you when you were 12? I laughed. "Grandma, I don't even know where that is." She said, "Find it." Asked why. She replied, "You'll understand later." Then she changed the subject. At the time I thought she was simply being sentimental. Now I wasn't so sure. I searched through my old belongings. Nothing. Then I remembered the storage box I had left at Grandma's house years ago. The problem? Daniel had the house. I didn't. I called my grandmother's longtime attorney, Mr. Harrison. He had handled her legal affairs for more than 20 years. I asked him if he knew anything about the will. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I was wondering when you'd call." My heart started racing. What does that mean? I can't discuss the estate over the phone. Why not? Because your grandmother gave me specific instructions. What instructions? Another pause. She told me not to open a certain file until after her funeral. I froze. What file? I think you should come to my office. The next morning I went. Mr. Harrison was waiting with a locked leather briefcase. He placed it on the desk. "This belonged to your grandmother." I stared at it. "What's inside?" He didn't answer. Instead he asked, "Did Daniel tell you that your grandmother left the house to the family?" "Yes." Mr. Harrison shook his head. "He lied." My heart dropped. "What?" "The document Daniel showed you was not the final will." I couldn't speak. Mr. Harrison opened the briefcase. Inside was a sealed envelope. My name was written across it in my grandmother's handwriting. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it. The letter began, "My dear Claire, if you're reading this, then something happened that I feared." I stopped. My eyes filled with tears. The letter continued, "Daniel believes everything can be controlled through money. He has been pressuring me for months." I looked up. "Why didn't she tell me?" Mr. Harrison sighed. "She didn't want you dragged into the conflict." I continued reading. Then I reached the part that changed everything. My grandmother had written that Daniel had been trying to convince her to sell the property. But she refused. The house wasn't simply a house. It sat on land that had become extremely valuable after a major development project was approved nearby. Daniel knew that. He wanted to sell it. My grandmother didn't. Then came the final paragraph. "The original documents are not in my house. Daniel searched for them once already." I looked at Mr. Harrison. "Where are they?" He handed me a small photograph. It showed an old wooden storage room behind the house. On the back was a handwritten sentence. "Look where your grandfather taught you to fix the radio." I immediately remembered. The workshop. It had been locked for years. My grandfather had taught me basic repairs there when I was a child. But Daniel had always called it junk storage. That evening, Mr. Harrison arranged for me to return to the property with him. Daniel was furious when he saw us. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Harrison calmly replied, "Conducting an estate inspection." Daniel stepped in front of the workshop. "You don't have permission." Mr. Harrison smiled. "Actually, I do." He produced a legal document. Daniel's face went pale. We entered. Dust covered everything. Old tools. Broken radios. Wooden shelves. Boxes. Then I saw it. A small brass key hanging from a nail. My grandmother's key. My hands trembled as I took it. There was a metal cabinet beneath the workbench. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a black folder. I opened it. The first page was the original deed to the property. The second was a copy of my grandmother's final will. And the third page contained something I never expected. A handwritten ownership agreement. The house had been placed into a private family trust years earlier. And the controlling beneficiary was me. I looked at Mr. Harrison. He nodded. "Your grandmother made this arrangement 7 years ago." "Why?" "Because she knew Daniel would eventually try to take control." I sat down. Everything suddenly made sense. The note. The warning. The hidden documents. But there was one more page. I unfolded it. It contained a list of financial transfers. Money had been disappearing from one of my grandmother's accounts for years. The recipient, Daniel. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I couldn't breathe. My brother hadn't just lied about the house. He had been stealing from our grandmother. Then we heard footsteps. Daniel entered the workshop. He saw the papers in my hands. His expression changed instantly. "Give me those." I stood. "No." He moved closer. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly. You're going to destroy this family." I looked him directly in the eyes. No, Daniel. You already did. The next morning, Daniel called a family meeting. He arrived with our parents and 2 lawyers. I arrived with Mr. Harrison. Everyone sat around the same dining table where Daniel had thrown me out less than a week earlier. This time, however, he wasn't smiling. One of his lawyers spoke first. We believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the property. Mr. Harrison placed the original documents on the table. There has been no misunderstanding. Daniel's lawyer looked at him. Mr. Harrison continued. The property belongs to the Evelyn Parker Family Trust. And who controls the trust? Daniel asked. Mr. Harrison looked at me. Claire. Silence. My mother covered her mouth. Daniel stared at me. That can't be true. It is. He turned toward my parents. You knew about this? They shook their heads. Daniel stood. This is ridiculous. Mr. Harrison opened another folder. This is also relevant. He placed the bank records on the table. Daniel froze. His lawyer looked at the documents. What are those? Transfers from Evelyn Parker's account. Mr. Harrison pointed to the recipient. Daniel Parker. My mother looked at Daniel. What is this? Daniel didn't answer. You told us Grandma gave you money for the business. I did. Mr. Harrison shook his head. She did not. He placed another document on the table. It was transferred without proper authorization. Daniel's face turned red. You're accusing me of theft? I'm presenting evidence. The room went silent. Then Mr. Harrison reached into his briefcase. There is one final document. Daniel immediately said, no. Everyone looked at him. He knew what was coming. Mr. Harrison placed a sealed envelope on the table. This is Evelyn Parker's final letter. He opened it. Then he began reading. My grandmother's words filled the room. She explained that she had known about Daniel's actions. She had forgiven him once. Then twice. But eventually she realized that forgiveness without consequences only encouraged bad behavior. She wrote that she had chosen me because I was the only person in the family who had never asked her for money. I started crying. But she wasn't finished. Her final instruction was simple. The house was not to be sold. The land was not to be divided. And the family trust was to remain independent. Then came the sentence that broke Daniel completely. If my son Daniel tries to take this property after my death, Claire is authorized to remove him from the estate immediately. Daniel slammed his hand against the table. She hated me. I finally spoke. No. Everyone looked at me. She loved you. I paused. She just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Daniel sat back down. For the first time in my life he looked small. Not powerful. Not successful. Just scared. The following weeks were difficult. The financial investigation began. Daniel had to repay a large portion of the money. His business partners learned what had happened. The family reputation he had spent years building collapsed almost overnight. My parents apologized to me. But I didn't immediately forgive them. I told them, you believed him because it was easier than believing me. My mother cried. I know. My father looked down. We were wrong. I nodded. I know. Forgiveness came later. But the house. I kept it. Not because I wanted the money. Not because I wanted revenge. I kept it because it represented something my grandmother had spent her entire life trying to teach me. Family isn't about who gets the biggest inheritance. It's about who protects what matters when nobody is watching. Months later I renovated the house. I kept my grandmother's bedroom exactly as it was. Kept the old workshop too. And above the workbench I framed the brass key. Whenever I looked at it, I remembered that terrible morning when Daniel told me to leave. I remembered thinking that I had lost everything. I hadn't. I had simply been pushed out of a house long enough to discover the truth about the people inside it. 1 year after my grandmother's death, I stood on the front porch at sunset. The house was quiet, warm, safe. For the first time it truly felt like mine. I opened the final letter again. At the bottom, beneath her signature, there was one last sentence I had somehow missed. It said, never measure your worth by what your family thinks you are worth. I smiled through my tears. Because my family had called me a failure. They had treated me like I had nothing. They had pushed me out of the house my grandmother left behind. And all along, I had been the person she trusted most. Not because I was the richest. Not because I was the strongest. But because I never needed her money to believe I had value. And that was the inheritance she actually wanted me to receive. Not the house. Not the trust. Not the fortune. The ability to stand alone. Even when everyone around me wanted me to believe I couldn't. The end.